I was 16 when I learned that trust is a luxury children can't afford, a lesson that came to me in the sweltering heat of a summer day that should have been filled with nothing more dangerous than sunburn and sticky fingers from melted ice cream. Growing up in a village so small that everyone knew everyone else's car by sight, where the entire population barely scraped 90 souls and children were allowed to roam freely from dawn to dusk without supervision, I had developed the kind of naive confidence that only comes from a lifetime of safety. The countryside where I spent my first 8 years was the sort of place where doors were left unlocked, where strangers were so rare they became the subject of dinner table conversation for weeks, and where the greatest danger seemed to be the occasional bull that wandered too close to the walking paths. It was a place where Julian, my best friend who would later become something much more, could spend entire days exploring without our parents giving it a second thought, armed with nothing more than pocket change and the unshakable belief that the world was fundamentally good. That particular day, the sun was merciless, beating down on us with the kind of intensity that made the air shimmer like water and turned every surface too hot to touch with bare skin. Julian and I were dying of thirst, our tongues practically stuck to the roofs of our mouths as we fantasized about ice-cold Coca-Cola, the kind that came in glass bottles and made that perfect hissing sound when you popped the cap. Back then, soda was cheap enough that even kids could afford it if they scrounged together enough loose change, but we were just short of what we needed for 2 cans, and neither of us wanted to trudge home and beg our parents for money. That's when salvation seemed to arrive in the form of an elderly woman who called out to us from her cottage garden, her weathered face creased into what seemed like a grandmother's smile as she explained that she was planning to make mint tea for her upcoming birthday celebration but had run out of the crucial ingredient. If we could fill 2 plastic bags with fresh mint leaves, she promised, she'd buy us all the soda we could drink. It seemed like a miracle, the kind of serendipitous solution that made the universe feel aligned in our favor, and Julian and I agreed immediately, our 7-year-old minds already tasting the sweet carbonation that would soon wash away the dust and sweat of the day. We spent hours under that blazing sun, our shirts soaked through with perspiration and our foreheads burning despite our constant efforts to wipe away the sweat, searching through fields and along fence lines for the distinctive serrated leaves and sharp scent of wild mint. But despite our determination and increasingly desperate efforts, we barely managed to fill half of the first plastic bag, the sparse plants we found seeming to mock our thirst and growing frustration. Both of us were starting to get genuinely angry, that particular kind of child's rage that comes from the gap between expectation and reality, as we realized there was no way we'd gather enough mint before sunset, no way we'd earn our promised reward. Still, we kept walking and searching, holding on to the foolish hope that some miracle would present itself, that we'd stumble across a field bursting with mint plants like something out of a fairy tale. That's when they appeared, materializing out of the heat haze like mirages made flesh, 2 figures approaching us across the empty countryside, their presence so unexpected in that familiar landscape that for a moment I wondered if the sun had finally gotten to me, if I was hallucinating from dehydration. When I say they were tall, I mean they seemed like giants to our 7-year-old perspective, probably no more than 5'7" in reality but towering over us like dark monuments against the bleached sky. What struck me as immediately wrong, though I lacked the vocabulary to articulate it at the time, was their clothing, heavy black hoodies and tight dark pants that seemed impossibly hot for the weather, their faces shadowed by those hoods despite the blazing afternoon sun. They couldn't have been older than 17, but there was something in their posture, something in the deliberate way they moved, that set every primitive alarm bell in my brain ringing even as my conscious mind struggled to understand why. They spoke to us in voices that were carefully modulated to sound friendly and childlike, their words chosen with the kind of precision that should have been another red flag, asking if we were out here alone with a casualness that felt rehearsed rather than spontaneous. Julian looked at me with an expression I'd never seen before, his usual easy confidence replaced by something that looked almost like fear, and he made a subtle hand gesture that I was too naive to interpret, too focused on these strange new arrivals to pay attention to my friend's growing unease. Instead of listening to Julian's silent warning, I responded with the kind of cheerful openness that had never gotten me into trouble before, explaining our quest for mint leaves and asking if they knew where we might find some, completely oblivious to the way one of them smirked when I mentioned what we were looking for, completely missing the way they exchanged a glance that had nothing to do with helping two thirsty children. One of them crouched down next to me, his face still hidden in the shadow of his hood, and patted my head with a familiarity that made my skin crawl even though I couldn't have explained why. Julian immediately stepped closer, pulling me back by the arm with an urgency that I finally began to recognize as panic, his voice tight with barely controlled fear as he asked them the question that was supposed to identify us as locals, as children who belonged here. Who are your parents? In our small community, that question was always answered with a last name, a way of placing someone within the intricate web of family connections that bound everyone together. But these strangers just looked at each other and avoided the question entirely, their attention focused on me with an intensity that made me feel like prey being evaluated by predators. Actually, one of them said, his voice taking on a tone that was almost excited, "I've seen a big field of mint plants. You see that hill over there? That's where we come from. If you want, we could lead you to the field and help you fill those bags, or even more." Julian and I knew that hill intimately. We'd played hide-and-seek in its forest countless times, had explored every inch of its slopes and valleys during our endless childhood adventures, and I knew with absolute certainty that there had never been any mint field there, that the only things that grew on those slopes were corn, grapes, and the occasional watermelon patch. But I was 7 years old and desperately thirsty and still believed that adults, even teenage adults, were fundamentally trustworthy, so I nodded eagerly and began pulling Julian along with me, completely ignoring the way his hand was trembling in mine, completely deaf to the silent screams of his terror. The strangers seemed satisfied with my compliance and began leading us away from the village, away from safety, away from everything familiar and into the kind of isolation that transforms ordinary people into victims. With each step, I could feel Julian's grip tightening on my hand, could sense his growing panic even as my own brain finally began to register that something was terribly, horribly wrong. The village disappeared behind us as we walked deeper into the countryside, and I realized with a sick feeling in my stomach that I could no longer see any signs of civilization, that we were entering the kind of empty landscape where screams would go unheard and where two small children could simply vanish without a trace. The forest loomed ahead of us, dark and impenetrable despite the afternoon sun, and I could see clearly now that there was no mint field, no convenient patch of herbs that would solve our problem and send us safely home. When I tried to ask our guides where exactly we were going, they gave me the kind of vague, evasive answers that parents warn children about. "You'll see and just be patient," their voices taking on an edge that made my blood run cold. I began to sweat from more than just the heat, my steps slowing as some ancient survival instinct finally kicked in and began screaming warnings that my conscious mind had been too innocent to hear. Panic was racing through my veins like electricity, and I realized with crystal clarity that something horrific was about to happen, that Julian and I had walked willingly into a trap that was about to snap shut around us. But even as every fiber of my being screamed at me to run, I found myself unable to stop walking, paralyzed by the terrible certainty that any attempt to flee would trigger something even worse, that these strangers were only maintaining their facade of friendliness as long as we continued to cooperate. Julian must have sensed the same thing, because he moved closer to me with the stealth of a hunted animal, his mouth barely moving as he whispered the words that would save both our lives. "There's something wrong with these two. Run." The world exploded into motion as Julian grabbed my hand and launched himself down the hillside like his life depended on it, which it absolutely did, dragging me along in a desperate sprint that had nothing to do with childhood games and everything to do with pure survival. I could hear the strangers cursing behind us, could hear the sound of pursuit beginning as they realized their carefully laid trap was collapsing, and I began running with a speed and desperation I didn't know I possessed, my legs pumping like pistons while tears of terror streamed down my face and my lungs burned with the effort of keeping up with Julian's frantic pace. The sound of our pursuers crashing through the undergrowth behind us added wings to our feet, and I found myself covering ground at a speed that should have been impossible for a 7-year-old. My entire world narrowed to the sensation of Julian's hand in mine and the desperate need to reach safety before whatever darkness was chasing us could catch up. I was crying so hard I could barely see, but I didn't dare stop or even slow down, some primal part of my brain understanding that this was a race for our very lives, that falling or stumbling would mean something unthinkably horrible. Somehow, impossibly, we made it back to the village, covering nearly 2 kilometers of rough terrain without stopping, without breathing, without doing anything except running like our lives depended on it. The woman who had sent us on our mint-gathering mission took one look at our tear-streaked faces and sweat-soaked clothes, at the way we were shaking and gasping for breath, and immediately brought us inside, wrapping us in the kind of maternal comfort that we desperately needed while Julian, his voice still shaky with adrenaline, explained what had happened. The woman's face grew grave as she listened, and she scolded us for our naivety, though she focused her anger on Julian, who lied and said he had wanted to trust the strangers while I had been reluctant to follow them, a lie that probably saved me from being forbidden to leave the house for the rest of the summer. As it was, Julian was grounded for a month while I spent weeks recovering from the psychological trauma, jumping at every shadow and waking up from nightmares where faceless figures in black hoodies chased me through endless forests. We never found out who those men were or what they had planned for us, though looking back now with the wisdom and cynicism of adulthood, I can make educated guesses that turn my stomach and make me grateful beyond words for Julian's quick thinking and quicker reflexes. If it wasn't for him, Julian, who later became my boyfriend and is now the love of my life, I don't want to imagine what those strangers would have done to 2 vulnerable children in the isolation of those woods, how our story might have ended if trust and innocence had been allowed to lead us all the way into their carefully prepared trap. The experience taught me that evil doesn't announce itself with fanfare and dramatic music, that predators often wear friendly faces and speak in soothing voices, and that sometimes the only thing standing between safety and horror is the wisdom to recognize danger when it's wearing the mask of kindness.